estimates are that before the war started, we had 1 million people suffering from PTSD, which is a very high number. That's triple the rates of the European nations or the US. So yes, our baseline was complicated. I don't think it was covered up. I think everybody that was in the field knew about it, but we could have gone on like this for years had October 7th not happened.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. I'm recording this on Sunday afternoon, a few hours after the Israeli army preemptively struck thousands of Hezbollah rocket launchers in Lebanon, doing so just 15 minutes before those launchers were supposed to fire hundreds of missiles into northern and central Israel. Thank God that as of now, Israel has clearly won this exchange. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, but for now, we can breathe just a bit easier than we did when we first heard the news early this morning. This event, like many others before it, highlights the reality that Israel is a nation that has been experiencing a kind of collective and individual trauma ever since October 7th. And Jews across the world, both because of the rise in antisemitism and because of their deep concern about what's happening in Israel, have experienced very real trauma as well. Trauma is not itself a type of mental illness, but it can lead to mental illness. And Jews in general, and Israelis in particular, are at risk of developing PTSD and other mental illnesses as a response to the events of the past year. Many people run the risk of experiencing suicidal ideation, depression, and more. And we need to determine if the medical community has the resources necessary to deal with a potential mental health crisis. Moreover, this also raises important and unavoidable halachic and hashkafic questions for those who diligently follow Jewish law. In order to talk about mental health, including what factors make it a potential crisis, the definition of trauma and PTSD, whether suicide has been on the rise, if any issues are being hidden from the public, the meaning of post-traumatic growth, how we can best prevent trauma from blossoming into mental illness, the problem of stigma, and what to do if you suspect that a friend is suffering from mental illness, I spoke with Gila Tolub, the co-founder and executive director of Ikar Collective. Afterwards, I had a conversation with Rav Yoni Rosensweig, the founder of Maglei Nefesh Center for Halacha, Community, and Mental Health, about some of the hashkafic and halachic issues that have arisen in the realm of mental health as a direct consequence of October 7th and the war against Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and Iran's other proxies. We'll get to those conversations in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Continue the discussion on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a very high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Gila Tolub brings 20 years of experience in strategy consulting and growth advisory, guiding leaders across industries to achieve their goals. A former McKinsey partner, she specializes in healthcare innovation with a particular focus on women's and brain health. As co-founder and executive director of Ikar Collective, Gila is committed to accelerating trauma healing in Israel. She also serves on the board of Ima Health, mentors future women leaders, and shares her expertise as a guest lecturer and speaker. Gila Tolub, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start off by reading a short news notification that appeared in the Times of Israel on August 14th. This is the quote. The Defense Ministry Rehabilitation Department says that it has received some 10,056 soldiers since the beginning of the war on October 7th. According to the Defense Ministry, some 3,500, or 35%, are suffering from PTSD or other mental disorders caused by trauma. Another 37% are suffering physical trauma to their limbs, the ministry says. Among the 10,056 soldiers, around 68% are reservists. The rehab department is also working with some 62,000 wounded veterans from previous wars. It forecasts that by 2030, the department will be treating some 100,000 people, with at least half of them suffering from PTSD. And that particular last line is what I want to get into today with you, Gila, because these are very disturbing numbers.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, part of the problem is that there was a mental health crisis in Israel prior to October 7th, which was only exacerbated by the events of October 7th and its aftermath. So we'll get into October 7th in a few moments. But first, can you elaborate on what was the case before October 7th, and was it being covered up in some way?
So I would rephrase that there's a mental health crisis globally, not just in Israel. Okay, there's a mental health crisis globally. It became very apparent during COVID-19 crisis. Everybody started talking about it, which was great because of how it helps with stigma, I would say, that suddenly it was okay to talk about mental health. And so I would say it's global, but now let's talk about Israel specifically, okay? So Israel is known for having one of the best health system in the world on the physical health side of things. We can be really proud of the health system that we have. We have a lot of data, a lot of digital access. We have universal healthcare, which means everybody has access to mental health, although access to mental health came a little bit later than physical health, and that's why we're still playing catch up. So we have a good system, but it's underfunded in mental health. So if you look at the percentage of the healthcare costs that goes to mental health out of the total, it is lower than OECD markets, and it is lower than the US, right? Israel spends about 5% on mental health, US about 7%, OECD markets about 10%. The other thing is that our baseline is a little different. We are a country of Holocaust survivors, children who have been exposed in Sderot to a lot of attacks and live with the consequences. And so estimates are that before the war started, we had 1 million people suffering from PTSD, which is a very high number. That's triple the rates of the European nations or the US. So yes, our baseline was complicated. I don't think it was covered up. I think everybody that was in the field knew about it, but we could have gone on like this for years had October 7th not happened.
Okay, so I saw on your website, Gila, the CAR website, that there are 3 particular areas where Israel had struggles in the mental health area before October 7th, and they are the number of people who have PTSD. You just mentioned that number, 1 million people, which is 3 times higher than other countries in the same economic sphere. There are too few psychiatrists and a general social stigma. Can you elaborate on those 3?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the high number I won't talk about again because we just spoke about it. The stigma is an important one. Before the war, it was reported that 1 in 3 Israelis, Jewish Israelis, would deny themselves access to care because of the shame or the embarrassment that it could lead to. And that's something that we need to work on and continuously work on. I think stigma is still existing everywhere in the world. I would say that in a lot of fields, we still have stigma, and sometimes the awareness can compensate for the stigma so that if you know where to get care, then it helps. And then your other point was about the shortage of mental health professionals. And again, this is not something that's specific to Israel. I have, from my background, I have the luxury of working with multiple health systems. And so I would say we have that problem in a lot of places in the world, but it's pretty acute here. There's only 1,000 practicing psychiatrists in the country, right? 1,000 means they all know each other. They can fit in the ballroom. Not only that, but many of them, about 400, are going to retire in the next 5 years. So they've been in the field for a long time. And only 270 are graduating from school in the next 5 years, right? And so we know that shortage problem is not going away. And it's something we need to work on. And it's something the country knows about.
Well, let me ask you, I don't know if this is answerable, but what can be done about that? Right now, I know just from my kids more than anything else, it's almost impossible to get into medical school in Israel, much harder than, for example, it is in the United States, where it's certainly hard. But in Israel, the degree of difficulty is much, much higher. There are fewer medical schools. There are fewer spots. How are we supposed to fix this? There aren't enough available universities for them.
No, that's right. And so, and I'll tell you even more, something that shocked me is that given there's so few psychiatrists, they also don't have time to train the next generation. So lo and behold, they told medical schools that they can't take fellows, students. But we know that if students can't experience that specialty, they're less likely to go into that specialty. So a few things that are being done. One, recruiting from outside of the country. So bringing in people and hiring from outside, bringing back Israelis into Israel. Two, opening new schools, like you said. Maybe that we can have more spots. So, for example, Reichman University is opening a new medical school. Sapir College just announced that they're going to go open a new medical school in partnership with Hebrew U, and that could help, but that will take a few years until we have those practitioners in the market.
Let me ask again about the social stigma. Is there something uniquely Jewish about that stigma? Meaning, is this something which is a specific problem in Israel in a way that's not necessarily true in other countries because, for example, I'm making this up now, I don't know, the Jewish applauding of the intellectual mind and so on and so forth. Is it a specifically Israeli problem, or is this the same problem in all countries?
I don't know. I think it's the same as in most countries. I do think there's something specific about, Middle Eastern countries where, you have more arranged marriage and what if, and, this is an Orthodox podcast, so you know how it could impact shidduchim and just, family members. So I think there is something about stigma in the Jewish community and the Arab community as well, right? Where it's a little bit harder. But I don't think there's a solution that's different than everywhere else, right? It's about, acknowledging. And, one of the examples that I really like is someone was saying, did we really kill the stigma in AIDS, right? We did such good work with AIDS, right? But I don't think we completely killed the stigma. I think if you talk to people and you say someone has AIDS, they're still going to think, who did he sleep with? And that's not going away. But the awareness is so high that people know that you can get help, people know that you can get treatment, the prevention levels are really high. And my hope is that even if we don't completely remove the stigma, we get to a level of awareness and access that people can get the care that they need in mental health.
Gila, until now, we've been speaking about mental health generally in a country that was founded in large part by people who had just survived the Holocaust, the Shoah. I remember watching a movie years ago called The Long Way Home. It's a documentary from 1997, which discussed the years between 1945 and the end of the Shoah and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And one of the people who spoke there talked about the attitude of some of the early Zionist leaders. And it was said in a very ungentle way, but I'll say what they said, something along the lines of that they were afraid that the new state of Israel would essentially be an asylum because so many people there would have mental illness. They didn't use the term PTSD, but they meant that they would have these lingering effects from being survivors of the worst atrocity ever perpetrated against human beings. And that has been something which we've carried with us. Obviously, October 7th is very different from the Shoah. At the same time, we are now dealing with a country which is traumatized, I'll use that term. So can you explain how the mental health crisis, or whatever you want to call it, has been exacerbated by October 7th in Israel?
Okay. So first, I'll start by saying that actually not everybody becomes PTSD when they've been through trauma. A lot of people ask me, how can we prevent trauma? I said, no, unfortunately, unless you have a direct line to Hamas, I don't know how to prevent trauma, right? But what we know how to do is to prevent PTSD. If you are surrounded by family, friends, that helps. We're pretty resilient human beings in general. So we know that even if we're exposed to very traumatic events, most of us will come out okay. I had a Nova survivor once ask me, I'm here because I don't want PTSD. We were at Chavat Ronit, a wedding hall that became a welcome center for Nova survivors. And we told him and said, well, you're here with your friends, your family? He said, yes. Said, okay, and you're feeling okay? Yes. And we said, that most people never get PTSD. Like, we're super resilient. And especially us, we have great epigenetics. Our parents are survivors, our grandparents are survivors, right? It goes through our blood. So you're probably going to be fine. And his entire body changed because he didn't know that most people turn out okay. And that's one thing that's very important to mention. When people say we're a country that's traumatized, yet we're a country that is living in a traumatic situation, but it doesn't mean that we're in a country where everybody's going to be PTSD.
Gila, if I can just say one thing about that, my co-host on Intimate Judaism and friend Tali Rosenbaum has pointed out to me more than once that there are two problems with people using that term PTSD without necessarily thinking about it. First of all, It's a diagnosis. It's not something which, oh, I'm traumatized, I have PTSD. It's just not
Exactly.
true. And second of all, and this is important, sometimes the problem is the P. Since we're not necessarily post,
No,
you can't be PTSD
exactly.
until the trauma's over. And now the trauma's not necessarily over for many people, unfortunately. So those are two important points I wanted to mention.
Exactly. We're in an ongoing traumatic situation. I was just discussing this yesterday with someone else where that says, oh, the country's post-trauma. Actually, some people were affected on October 7th, but last week we had a few soldiers that passed away and their family had traumatic, situations just now, right? And soldiers, get injured and are going through battles. And so some of them are exposed last week, not on October 7th. So we are really in an ongoing traumatic situation. And it's such a long one that we also don't understand exactly how it impacts people, right? So when someone has a car accident and you start to speak with them a week, 2 weeks later, you can really ask them to put the past in the past and think about the event in the past, right? But given we're still in the war and we're still living under that existential threat, it is very hard to tell people to move forward. And so that's why what you're mentioning is extremely important.
Let's talk a little bit about the way that things have become traumatic on October 7th and thereafter. In fact, I want to follow up on something you just said. You talked about soldiers who unfortunately were killed and people who have been very seriously injured. And then there's the fact that last week and this week, people have been extremely, I'm going to use the term in a general sense, traumatized by the threat of Iran bombing Israel and
Right.
the threat of Hezbollah sending rockets, which has been a constant threat, but it goes up and down at different times. To what degree can we call that trauma? Because on some level, I think there's a certain cheapening of calling that trauma when other people are literally losing their lives and their families are changed forever in a terrible way. And for me to say, well, it's traumatizing to have the threat of Iranian bombs on us, it's not the same thing. Can we call that trauma?
So there are different things. I would call that acute stress, or chronic stress or something like this, right? And being in chronic stress is something that can lead to trauma. So, for example, a child right now whose father or mother is in reserve duty and is fearing for the life of his parent all day long, every day, and for example, is taking on the role of the adult in the house because the dynamic are changing when a parent is out. Those things can lead to longer term impact, right? But it's the fact that it's this chronic stress that makes this a traumatic event. I would say another thing on children, and it resonated with me when you were talking about the current stressful situation. I'm here in the US for a wedding, and I left my husband and my 4 children, in that period where we're waiting for Iran to attack, right? And it's when you talk about the impact on children, for example, we know that it's very much about the attachment with the parents. And so it's the work that we need to do now is making sure that the parents are available to the children, are not retracting in their fear, are not retracting in that and cutting that relationship with the children. That's what would cause more longer term stress on the child and more trauma, I would say. And I think another thing you mentioned, which is important, is just this idea of losing friends and family members. There's grief. There's a lot of grief that's mixed in. And it's not exactly the same as trauma. And there's complicated grief when people are murdered and killed. And so we have to deal with both and figure out, the impacts of both on people.
In that case, Gila, can I ask you to define the term trauma? We're using that word and throwing it around, but I don't know exactly what it means. What is trauma?
Sure. So trauma means that you have been exposed to close death or to something that really threatened your existence. It could be direct. So it was you that was in the situation, or it could be someone that you loved and that you witnessed that as well. Or it could be indirect, where you've seen the images, heard the images, social media.
And what is the impact, generally speaking, of trauma on the individual?
Right. And you see at the beginning of this conversation, we spoke a lot about mental health in general. So trauma, exposure to trauma, is a predicting factors for actually most psychiatric disorders. We talk a lot about PTSD, but trauma could lead to increased eating disorders, anxiety, depression, all of the gamut of psychiatric disorders. But more than that, trauma impacts your physical health. It impacts your cardiovascular health when you have those level of stress. It impacts, your immune system. A lot of people develop autoimmune system. My daughter, after New Year's Eve, when we were at a wedding, she was by herself with my kids at home, and she's little. Her parents weren't home. She developed shingles in the morning, and shingles is an autoimmune response, and that was in response to the stress level. And now more and more research is linking cancer to traumatic events. And the other thing besides for health is that it impacts productivity. We know children are 2.5 times more likely to repeat a grade after traumatic events. Parents and adults are less productive. I mean, imagine now we have those reserve soldiers who come back, but they know they're going to have to go back. And so for 3 weeks, they're back at work. Like, what does it even mean, right? You go from Gaza to an office in a high-rise building in Tel Aviv, and you're supposed to be coding something. Like, the meaning, you go from one to the other. And lastly, I worry about the security of the nation, not only because our soldiers, like you mentioned, are injured physically and mentally, and therefore that puts at risk our security, but because when your serotonin levels, which is out of whack because of the traumatic events we're in, we are more impulsive, we're more aggressive. That leads to more car accidents, that leads to more domestic abuse, that leads to self-medication and drug abuse. And so trauma can really have impact on health, on productivity, and on security of the nation. And that's why it's so important that we are doing everything we can to accelerate the healing, not just for mental health, but for all of this.
I want to ask about that a little bit more, Gila, because you mentioned before that while we can't prevent trauma, we can prevent it from being manifest in PTSD and presumably in other mental health disorders. So before we talk about treating it once it already is manifest, what are some of the ways that people who've experienced traumatic situations can prevent it from turning into something else?
So there's a lot, of theory and ideas. One of the things we know is, for example, restoring positive interpersonal relationship is one of the things that can lower the risks. What it means is, those folks on October 7th, right, lost almost trust in humanity. I mean, they saw such horrible things, human beings doing things to other human beings. The sooner those people reconnect with humanity and understand that it's still there, the sooner they'll be able to heal. So right now, the word, we use is early intervention. Again, there are debates around, is it too late, not too late to do early intervention? The people that have been exposed on October 7th, do we consider that we could still help? But it's really about, using different techniques. There's a new program called OMIA in Israel that was developed by Shalvata Hospital and Columbia University. That's really developing protocols on what are the type of treatment we should give people now to prevent them from developing PTSD and other psychiatric disorders.
I'm going to go back to something which I mentioned before because I want to expand on it a little bit and hear what you have to say about it. What about the concept of survivor's guilt? And I'll tell you what I mean by that. There are people out there who have, as you mentioned, they were at the Nova Festival. They live in Sderot. They live in Kfar Aza. They live in places that were deeply, deeply affected, where they saw family members and friends slaughtered in front of their eyes. They saw people kidnapped and their whereabouts are still unknown. And then there's someone who lives in Yerushalayim or Beit Shemesh or Tel Aviv whose traumatic situation was hearing about that. It was not direct. It might also, of course, be very, very serious. It might also be the kind of situation where they have kids in the army. It might be a situation where they are afraid because they don't know what's going to come next. It doesn't mean it's not traumatic. Part of the problem is when the trauma was so acute and so deep, I think there's an element of survivor's guilt in the sense that people are afraid to even call that trauma because on some level it pales in comparison to what survivors of the Nova Festival, for example, have to deal with. And yet at the same time, those people do need to make sure they take care of themselves. Am I right?
That's right. And that's where psychoeducation is so important, and understanding what is a normal reaction and what is not, right? So for example, you have people who tell me, my son has lost 2 friends and I don't think he's doing well. It's like, why? He's not talking to me much. Yeah, but you're his mom, right? Is he talking to his friends? Yeah, he's talking to his friends. Okay. So it's normal that he's sad. He's grieving. There's so many responses that are normal, but is it impacting the way he functions, right? And there's an element of impairment of your functionality And if you're functionally impaired and you can't do your day-to-day activities, that's when you really need help, right? And so when people say, I don't know how you do this work, and I tell them, I said, sometimes I cry already at 9:48 in the morning, and again at 11:52, but then I have this resilience mechanism where I'm okay to go back to work, right? And if I'm not able to do that, that's when I know I need a break. That's when I know I need to do something else. And so it's really about this functional impairment. And some people might be really impacted, even though they live in Bet Shemesh in Yerushalayim. We also don't know people's history. It might wake up trauma from years ago or ancestral trauma that they had buried very deeply. And so there isn't a judgment, or there isn't a ranking of people's pain, right? Everybody that feels they need the support because of to leave their day-to-day should get the help.
I just want to make sure we repeat that, because I think that's a very, very important point. Al regel achat, in a simple level, is the line between you need help and you need to go to a professional, you need to be treated, versus you're sad or you're grieving and you can manage it on your own without getting an expert's help, is really functional impairment. Is that an accurate statement?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, it's like, do you like getting a massage? I like to get a massage, right? And so some people will gain from going to speak to a therapist, but do they have to go speak to a therapist? Sometimes I worry, because I don't want people to think, oh, there's such a shortage, I shouldn't go speak to a therapist. We should let the people who really need it, have access. And we know that happens. By the way, statistics, that's crazy. I heard the first week of the war, between October 7 and October 14, not one single call to the police from abused women, right? We know when the system is overloaded and we should put our needs on the side, right? I don't want that to happen today to people who say, oh, my situation is not as bad as so, and so I'm not going to call the therapist. At the same time, if you're sad and you're still functioning, it's normal. You're having a normal relationship. If you weren't sad, I would be worried.
That's interesting. I want to ask about soldiers in particular and mental health, because something which I've been told, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but we often hear about the soldiers who are chas v'shalom killed in battle. We hear a lot less about the many thousands who've been injured, and part of that also are the many thousands who are having mental health crises. That's something which is extraordinarily difficult and important and problematic. And yet at the same time, it's not something which makes the papers in the same way. Can you talk just a little bit, Gila, about soldiers and mental health since October 7th?
Yeah. So I do think that, one of the silver lining is that we're talking about it, right? For example, there are flyers now that every soldier, has access to, that we send to people around, if you're a Miluimikim, here are the numbers you call if you need mental health support. If you're in the army, here's where you would go. Do we have enough? Most people will tell you no. And is it super easy to get access? Maybe not as easy as we want it to be, but at least we're talking about it. Someone told me something really that really struck with me. Said every time you hear on the news allowed to release, there's this expression on the radio that,
Right.
and the next thing is going to be someone's dead, and here's the name.
Permitted for publication or something like that, right?
Yeah, something like that, right? It's when the news is allowed to release the name of who was killed. And someone told me every time you hear this, there's another 3-4 names of people who are injured and who we're not talking about, right? And now it's really stuck with me, because you're right that every time someone is killed, there are a lot more that are injured, and there are a lot more that are mentally impaired and again, most of them will get better with time and will be okay, but we need now to give them access to the care. And unfortunately, one thing that makes me really sad is that we're sending some of them back to battle because we don't have enough reservists right now. And so some of them that should be getting care, should be going to therapy, we don't have a choice. They have to go back to Gaza.
And that will presumably impact their ability to be effective soldiers.
It could. Hopefully the army is doing enough to make sure that those who are going back are not functionally impaired, like we discussed, and sending only those who can go on.
When my son-in-law came out of Gaza in the beginning of January, He had to go back again in April, May, back up north. But when he came out of Gaza, I know part of his release, the week-long process of being released from the reserve duty, was going to see a therapist or a psychologist. Of course, that was just 1 day or 1 hour within 1 day that every soldier had to go through. And it's good that the Army does that. It's also clearly not nearly enough. The things that he saw in Gaza, I'm sure, require more than just 1 hour or whatever it is with a therapist at the end of the service. I know that the Army has to put a check next to that box, and that's better than nothing. I am concerned about all of our soldiers. When the war is hopefully going to be over at some point, they will have seen some real serious stuff, and I just don't know if there are the resources available to take care of all these soldiers those who are in acute stress and acute trauma, that's one thing, but everybody's going to need help, I would assume.
That's right. I mean, and there's a lot that we cannot deal with, going back to our discussion, while we're in it, right? So there's this ongoing situation, and it's a big question. At the beginning of the war, we didn't know how long it would last. And there was a debate around, do we let the soldiers actually go home, or do we keep them in this fight mode, right? Because if they go home and they get relaxed and they're with their parents and their family members and their children, well, they want to come back, and can we take that chance, right? And now, I mean, the war is so long that obviously everybody was allowed to go home. But this is a real question, and I'm worried also about the day after. I think we're still in it, and the adrenaline levels are probably protecting a lot of us. That will not be the case after the war.
Gila, I don't know if this is true because it's hearsay from my perspective. Maybe you can tell me that it is true, or maybe you won't know. There is actually a problem of suicide among soldiers in Israel, among IDF reservists, active soldiers. And secondly, also problematic, that on some level it's not really being talked about. It's being covered up. Could you talk about whether either or both those are true?
Okay. So first, I'll touch on this part of covering up. There is a real worry that suicide is contagious. There's been a lot of research shown that when there's a movie about suicide, when there is a very dramatic suicide of someone that, goes in front of a train or whatever, a few months after that, we see more suicides or more people jumping in front of trains, like the ideation, and so there's a debate again, psychiatrists are worse than Jews. You have 5 opinions, right? But Israel has taken that stance. Israel has taken the stance that for the health of people and to avoid contagion, we're not going to talk about suicide. And so unfortunately, it means a lot of people think there's a cover-up and there's a lot of conspiracy theory, but it comes from a place that's not a bad place. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I heard this week, like this ad that was like every 15 minutes, a soldier commits suicide. That's just wrong. Okay. That's just really like wrong. And it's twisted to use this kind of language to raise money. We right now, based on the latest intel from the people that really know, Israel does not have excess suicide. So I don't know if you understand the concept of excess death, excess suicide. I'll explain for the listeners. It just means that we don't see more suicides than we would have seen had there not been a war, right? During COVID, we talked a lot about excess death. And sometimes people say there's no excess death. And they would say it's because people are dying of COVID-19, but they're not dying of car accidents because they're just at home, right? So now we have no excess suicide because the people that would have been good candidates for suicide now have maybe found meaning in their life or busy helping others. Maybe they found out that their lives is not as bad as they thought they were because they're in a situation. But on the other hand, you have people committing suicide that we didn't expect them to commit suicide. They were exposed to things during the war, parents of Nova survivors or things like this, right? And so right now, what I'm hearing is there's no excess suicide. There's just a different distribution. It doesn't mean that we won't have more after the war. Like I said, I'm worried about the day after. And that's why we're helping many nonprofit organizations that are doing work on prevention, on suicide prevention, on discussing, there's a group called Moshe that's helping folks during crisis intervention, Gila's Way with Rabbi Shalom Hammer, multiple people that are doing great work to make sure that it doesn't happen. But they are seeing more calls now than before.
I'm very pleased to hear that there isn't a cover-up, that there's actually a reason behind what's going on. It's not some sort of sinister movement, but rather something which is being done thoughtfully for a good reason. I want to ask you about sort of a strange question. This is maybe going to relate to some of our listeners who are outside of Israel. I think a lot of people in Israel are experiencing isolation, a sense of no one can understand what we're going through. And even those people who are outside of Israel, who are Jewish themselves, who are deeply concerned about Israel, on some level, despite the fact that they care deeply about Israel and think about Israel all the time, the way that somebody said it to me a few months ago, which I think was very astute, he said, and he's outside of Israel, he goes, I think about Israel 100 times a day, but you don't think about Israel 100 times a day. In other words, someone living outside of Israel is thinking about Israel all the time, but his default is not to. Whereas we in Israel, our default is to always be thinking about the war and what's going on, and maybe occasionally we can distract ourselves. And that has created, at least for some, a sense of isolation from those who are our co-religionists, our nation, our family, but don't understand. Is that also a source of certain types of trauma, or perhaps an experience that can lead to mental health problems, or not?
It's an interesting question. And I thought you were going a different way, because actually me being in Israel, I I hear from a lot of people in the US and in other countries that they feel a lot of isolation. Okay. Because so I come from France. Antisemitism is nothing new. At age 5, I already know people don't like Jews, right? And so but I have my American friends who are falling from really, really high, right? I spent 12 years in the US and people really felt like we were well integrated. There's not that much anti-Semitism. And what I'm hearing is now this feeling of loneliness within the US around, wow, I thought I was, a liberal Jew, well assimilated. The values are, we share 95% of the values, but suddenly doesn't apply to me as a Jew, right? And that plus the fact that many people had an unconscious feeling of security, knowing that we have an Israeli state, that if anything happens in America, I can always go to the US, to Israel. And that has been also put into question about, oh, wait, can I go to Israel? Like the state is also at stake. So I heard that feeling of loneliness very much coming from outside of Israel. In Israel, on the other hand, we actually feel like, well, we're all in this together. We all get it. There's nowhere we want to be. I feel more safe in Israel than, outside of Israel sometimes, right? But there's this dissonance between the Jews of the diaspora and the Jews of Israel. And I got to America yesterday, and I think it's true that there's a different way we think. I was on the tarmac, and the pilot said, the control tower has asked us to wait. And I texted my husband right away. I said, if I was in Israel right now, I would be I would have all these things in my head around, oh, Iran is about to attack. That's why we can't take off. But because I'm not in Israel, it's like, oh, okay, we're late, And it's just little things, right, that show that we're totally not in the same state of mind based on where we are.
I remember that a similar experience, I think, about 20 years ago when the Intifada was raging in Israel. And then I would visit my family in the United States and I would hear an ambulance go by. And even though when I was in Israel, the vast majority of the ambulances weren't for terrorist attacks, still, when you hear it, you hold your breath for a moment. Whereas being in Boston or New York, you don't have to hold your breath. It was like, it's fine. It's not fine for everybody, but it's not a terrorist attack. That's not what's going on there. At least that was my experience. I want to ask you about some potential solutions, because you have talked about the various types of traumatic situations people find themselves in and maybe ways that we can prevent it from becoming PTSD or other mental health disorders. What about once it's already become a full-blown mental health crisis? A person is suffering from PTSD or other mental health problems. Apart from getting help from a therapist, are there general solutions that either individuals or the society can provide?
So first of all, yes, there I would say first on the treating side, right? We have now evidence-based methods for people who struggle, and multiple, so that we could try to adapt to the specific person, to what they're going through. In general, community plays a very important role, right? I mean, you spoke about isolation. In general, community plays a very important role. I think one interesting piece of information that we talk a lot about when we talk about veterans is Israeli veterans suffer way less from PTSD than American veterans. And it's really just like, why? Like the country itself, we have 3 times the incidence rate of the other countries. Why are our veterans less affected? And one of the things that researchers explain is this sense of community. When the Israeli soldiers come home, they're heroes, and we know they went there to protect us. And we all understand that those soldiers are our children. They could be any of us, right? When soldiers came back from Vietnam, you remember like all the demonstrations, and they were called baby killers, and many of them ended up living on trailer parks by themselves, and that just doesn't happen, right? So I would say like that community environment is extremely important. That's why Israel did such a huge effort to keep the displaced kibbutzim together, right? They didn't say go to your family members, find a spot in Israel. They really kept them together because that sense of belonging and community was a very important thing.
Let me ask about religion and its role in helping. Obviously, religion itself is a community, so in that sense, a shul can be a community, a Beit Midrash could be a community. Are there other ways that religion or religious institutions can help either the prevention of mental health disorders or the treatment of them?
Yeah, I spent 12 years at McKinsey, and McKinsey has a group called McKinsey Health Institute, which was created during COVID-19 to look at healthcare globally. And funny enough, even though it's a consulting firm, totally secular, the definition of healthcare that was adopted is holistic health is mental health, physical health, social health, and spiritual health. And when you ask, what is spiritual health, it doesn't have to be about religion, but it's about having a purpose. It's about having meaning. And religion is very important for this. At the beginning of the war, someone saw that we invited a Chabad rabbi to come talk to the Nova survivors. And someone told me, one of the problems we're going to have with this war is with too many people that are going to be choser b'tshuva, that are going to return to Judaism. And, I said, as a religious woman, I would like to say that if those kids want to become Buddhist right now, I would support them. They just need some kind of connection with spirituality, whatever it is, right? And if you look at what happened after the Yom Kippur War, some people were choser b'sheila, some people were choser b'tshuva because your faith is attacked. And so also a lot of people, say, I don't believe in God anymore. And then some people look for the spirituality, and so they come back to it. And some people said, I leave Israel because I can't live in this anxiety and this stressful. So there was a lot of yerida, but there was a lot of aliyah because people from Chutz La'aretz said, I can't be away from Israel when all of this is happening. And I think we're going to see this happening. And that just shows how trauma impacts people differently based on where they are in their life and based on what they find meaningful. And so, to me, religion plays a big role, but because of that spirituality element, but it can go many different ways.
Gila, what should those of us who hopefully are not suffering from a mental health disorder look for in people such that we can tell them, I think you need to get help? You mentioned before, if they're functional, that's one of the dividing lines. But when talking with friends, when dealing with family members, that may not be obvious. As you mentioned before, a mother said about her son, I think there's a problem because he's not talking to me. And the answer is, well, maybe it's because you're his mother and he wants to talk to his friends. If any of us see something, is there any sort of red flag that we should be looking for? And then what do we do about it if we do see that?
First of all, you'd be surprised at how little people actually ask others, are you okay? We pass by people, say, hey, what's up? Hey, how are you? But we don't wait for the answer. There's actually a campaign that Enosh, who's one of the big mental health organization in Israel, brought from Australia. And it's called #AreYouOkay. And it's a big campaign and movement to say, just ask people, are you okay? On the workplace and at home. In my workplace, I remember during COVID, we got a training program that we needed to ask our junior colleagues, are you okay, twice? Because the first time they were going to say, yeah, sure, let's get to work. But if you say, no, but for real, are you okay? Then that's when the answer would come. So I would say first, make sure you create that space for people to actually share how they're doing, because I'm not even sure that happens. And then once they share, it's about understanding, what is a normal reaction versus what is impacting them in a way that shouldn't, in a way that, you could pick up that the person is not functioning that they should. And And again, if you have any doubt, reach out to a professional. You shouldn't feel like, you're taking someone else's space. We had a lot of teenagers who were survivors from October 7th, who would say, my mom needs this more, my younger sibling needs this more. And so they wouldn't get help. And that's not okay, right? Everybody deserves to get the help. So listen, and sometimes even that listening is enough.
But what if somebody really is not okay? What if in asking that second time, no, really, are you all right? And they say, no, I'm not. Now what? I, as a non-mental health professional, wouldn't know what to do next.
Could you ask them to go speak to a professional? Is there anyone you can recommend they go speak to? It's hard to help people who don't want to be helped in mental health. And so I think then in this case, the idea would be to really support the person in taking that first step in calling for support.
Gila, can you define post-traumatic growth? I know that's very different from PTSD, but what is post-traumatic growth?
So post-traumatic growth is this idea that actually 30% of people that go through a very traumatic event end up growing from it and doing amazing things that they may not have done had they not had been in that situation. At the personal level, we see a lot of examples of that, right? People who go through a terrible loss, people who go through terrible events, and then they use this, it fuels them to help others, create organization, change policies, right? And they grow into something that they probably would not have been without that event. At the collective level, we also see that many nations, and dare I say, even the Jewish nation, after very traumatic events, we see a post-traumatic growth, something that really takes us to the next level. And that's what we mean by it. It means, once you go very, very low, you then come back up and higher than you were before.
Is that something which happens on its own, or is it something that we can foster such that people who have experienced a trauma, we can just hope that they'll experience this growth, or is it something that we can actually help happen?
It's a very good question. I do think there's ways to help make it happen. I mean, but again, it's a lot about the mindset, right? I don't know if you've heard about the book from Edith Eger, The Choice, right? And she's a Holocaust survivor.
My wife has recommended that I read that book. She said it's fantastic.
You should. You should. And I don't know if you read In Search of Meaning, but when I read The Choice, I kept thinking about Viktor Frankl, In Search of Meaning. And then in the book, she says that he became one of her teachers because someone actually said, oh, you guys think similarly and you're both from Hungary, etc. And one of the things she explains is how you could think about yourself as a victim or as a survivor. And the way that changes, right? If you see yourself as a survivor, not as a victim, and you use this as fuel, right? Then you could do bigger, bolder things. And so, I don't know how you can do it at an individual level, but it's, helping people find their own strength to do this. I'll give you a real example, actually, from 2-3 weeks ago. I was organizing a roundtable. The Joint and Natal have a program called Chozrim LaMaslul, going back to the path, right? And it's for people who are after a traumatic event, either physically injured or only quote unquote, mentally injured. And they're helping them with vocational training on how to go back to work. And there's a discussion of, is healthcare sequential, get better physically, then get better mentally, then go back to work? Or do we do this holistically? Actually, working on your mental health will help you get better physically as well. And working on your physical health makes you better mentally. And having something to do that's meaningful helps you heal. And so maybe vocational training is a good thing to do at the same time. And this woman shared that they were giving, they had a first session with the father of a hostage that came home. And he said, he had forgotten who he was before the war. He had forgotten that his entire life is not this situation, that he's a very successful business person who has a lot to give, who has a lot that he can give to Israel and to society in general. And, this vocational training workshop or coaching, suddenly he remembered, right? And now he can go back into action. And of course, it will take time. I'm not saying it's a light switch and that's it, but it is important to help people get back to that. and find meaning and then grow.
Okay, Gila, as a final question, I want to ask you about the organization you founded called IKAR. What is that?
So the idea of IKAR is that many NGOs are in the field and everybody's busy with their own population, their own niche. And I realized quickly that there wasn't anyone taking a population health look at what was going on in the country. No one was saying, should we invest in that population, that population? Should we do more on the prevention side or on the treatment side? And it's a very fragmented landscape. So we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that mental health is underfunded. What happened is people in business know when something is perceived as a cost center, I have to do it, but it's a cost center. The best way to do it is to outsource it. And so what happened is mental health has been outsourced for the longest time to family members. You have someone that struggles, you take care of your own, and then to NGOs. And today, so much has been outsourced to NGOs that we have hundreds and hundreds of organizations that are providing solutions and services in the field. And so having that view of who's doing what, is it answering the needs? And is there anywhere where we need to put more resources or more money? That was not happening. And so we decided to build IKAR to do that, to create a mapping of who's doing what and is it answering the needs? And if not, where can we put in some resources, which allows us to do number 2, prioritization of the impact areas where we think there would be a disproportionate return on investment by investing times and resources. And number 3, advancing the field. So I mean by that is that I do a lot of shidduchim when I hear this organization is working on something very similar to that one, or that one is missing an expert on that topic. So we just advance the field by connecting people with the right folks. Over time, we have 2 more goals, which are 1, to help use the knowledge to advance policy shaping, and 2, the same way Israel became the mother of innovation in a lot of fields, right? Like water technology or cyber defense, because necessity is the mother of innovation. Then maybe mental health, the same thing could happen. We have now this petri dish where we could do a lot of experience and figure out what works, what doesn't work. Can we get to a better personalized medicine in mental health? And can we then share that with the rest of the world and advance the field globally?
I suppose that's potentially an example of post-traumatic growth for the state of Israel as a whole.
That is correct.
Okay, well, Gila Tolub, I really appreciate all of your work that you're doing, and I appreciate your coming on the podcast today to explain this. This is a very, very important idea. We're dealing with a country of 9 million people who have been through a traumatic situation, and the goal is to try and make sure it doesn't turn into something that it doesn't have to turn into, or if it does, become something like PTSD or mental health disorders for people. They have something they can do about it in order to try and manage it as best they can. So I appreciate you joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rav Yoni Rosensweig is rabbi of the Netzach Menashe community in Beit Shemesh and founder of Maglei Nefesh Center for Halacha, Community, and Mental Health. Rav Yoni Rosensweig, thank you for joining me again on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Rav Yoni, have you noticed an uptick in the number of questions or the frequency of questions regarding halacha and mental health since October 7th?
That's actually a complicated question to answer. People assume all the time that I must be inundated with questions because of the events of October 7th and specifically to do with post-trauma or depression. But that is not exactly correct. The reason it's not exactly correct is because what people do when they are affected by war is they don't go to a rabbi to ask a halachic question. The first thing they do is they go to a mental health professional. They require the help that they need. They're more in survival mode than they are trying to thrive in their everyday. I answer questions for people who are dealing with their everyday situations. And people are not in their everyday. They're in the middle of a crisis. So in the middle of a crisis, what you do is you make sure that you're surviving. But now, in the last, I would say 3, maybe 4 months, but mostly I would say maybe 3 months is more correct to say, now that people are settling back into their communities and back into their routine, they're finding that they can't actually settle into their routine. What they're finding is that the war has affected them, that the changes sometimes imperceptible and sometimes more perceptible, are definitely affecting their everyday lives. And yes, we are seeing that uptick now. And I think we're actually, if you interviewed me in a year from now, I think you'd find that we were seeing it much more then, for sure.
That's very interesting. I'm curious about one thing. When you talk about they, I want to know who the they are, the people who are settling back. Obviously, I'm not speaking about anyone in particular, but generally speaking, are the people asking questions those people who have undergone the acute trauma of something serious like being injured or worse, that they lost family members in the war? Or are you speaking more about people who, like everybody in Israel, has experienced a traumatic situation, but hasn't necessarily been personally affected in that extreme way?
So, not to get too technical, and also not to go into a field that's not my own, right? But just to be clear, where there's trauma and there's post-trauma, many people may go through a traumatic event. It does not mean that they will develop post-trauma. That is a whole different thing. So if we talk, right, the numbers are usually, let's say, 10% of people who will develop post-traumatic symptoms. Like half of that, of the 10%, will also get over it, will be able to find the tools of resilience to get through. So therefore, just because, and I know people say in Hebrew, we say Medina betrauma. We say the whole country is has been traumatized all the time since the beginning of the state. But even though that may be on some level true, we must differentiate between trauma and post-trauma. Yes, many people go through difficult events and are, so to speak, traumatized, but they have resilience and they have strength and they have the energy to get through it, and they do get through it. But yes, those individuals that can't, right, and that could be, and this answers your question, that could be soldiers coming back from battle. It could be the wives or the mothers, who can't fall asleep every night, et cetera, because of what their family members are going through. It could be bereaved families. It could be a million and one sorts of situations. You're right. It doesn't have to be a soldier who was specifically in war and came. No, it doesn't have to be that thing. It could be all kinds of scenarios, and all those individuals, whether it's first-hand trauma, second-hand trauma, could develop post-trauma, and it's that percentage of the population that I am mostly seeing affected by October 7th.
Now, when you talk about trauma, we know that, of course, halakha recognizes a category called mental illness. However, is there a category, halachically speaking, for trauma, or is that not really a halachic category per se?
None of the mental health designations are a halachic category in and of themselves, but they of course fall into a halachic category. So if I had to, and once again, to hopefully succinct and clear for your listeners, if I had to put post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, into a category, I would put it somewhere between chole she'en bo sakana and chole sheyesh bo sakana, meaning that at the lower end, right, someone who is diagnosed with PTSD would almost always, I don't want to give 100%, but I would say almost always be designated minimally as a chole she'en bo sakana, someone who is unwell halachically and deserving of certain leniencies, but in the more difficult cases could definitely rise to a level of a chole sheyesh bo sakana, where the person is in a life-threatening situation. So, and to sum up, we're certainly dealing about a cluster, shall we say, of individuals who are affected significantly by their mental health concerns, and halacha would respond also significantly to that fact.
Let me ask you in a general sense, because you're talking about how halakha has these categories like a chole she'en bo sakana, a sick person who is not in danger of losing his life, and we put mental illnesses into those various categories. As a general question, Rav Yoni, how do you do that? Meaning, I'm guessing that most of the Rishonim didn't think in those terms when it came to mental illness for the most part. They probably used terms like shota, which is a different category altogether if somebody were incapacitated mentally. But simply having what we would call now PTSD, they may not have thought of that as much more than, I don't know what, something you have to get over. So how do you know how to put this into particular categories when I'm guessing there isn't that much precedent for it, unless I'm wrong?
No, you're right. You're right. And we have spoken about this, I think, in your program before. But on the off chance that someone didn't listen to that episode, I will say this.
It happens.
Which is that, it happens, yeah. I will say this, which is that the halacha responds to tachlis. In other words, the halacha will always respond to a practical scenario, a practical situation. To put it differently, I don't really care on some level why the person is bedridden. It could be a fever, it could be depression, it could be his OCD, it could be his ADHD, and it could be post-trauma. But at the end of the day, is the person bedridden? Is he in bed? Is he functionally impaired? If the person is functionally impaired, that is a reality. And that reality is something that the halacha can, so to speak, sink its teeth into. So therefore, you're right. The category for PTSD doesn't exist as is in Chazal. But the rabbis definitely responded to a real situation. Functional impairment is something which accompanies PTSD almost by definition, meaning if you look in the DSM-5, you will see that functional impairment is part of the diagnosis. And therefore, I said it is 99% of the time, goes together with PTSD, that it's minimally cholish and bosakana because of the functional impairment that comes with it. And so too also for other things, depression, which might also be affected by the war, anxiety, which might be affected by the war. Whenever functional impairment is there, regardless of how we look at the definitions exactly, or whether we can find an exact parallel for them in the sources, the halacha will respond to that.
I'm wondering also about the concept of stigma. When I spoke with Gila about this, it seems that stigma is one of the major impediments to people getting help. I'm wondering if that's something which you've experienced as well in terms of people coming to get a psak, that while they may be very willing to go and talk to you if they have a sore throat on a fast day, talking about PTSD or depression may be something they're less likely to go to you. Is that your experience?
I think that I'm not a good example of that, because I think with me, my work in this field has dispelled much of the stigma surrounding coming to me and asking me a question. But nevertheless, in general, yes, I think that you're right about that. Meaning the kinds of questions that I get could be accompanied with significant stigma, right? The extreme being, feelings that a person wants to die, that they want to take their own lives. Things along those lines, which are definitely not something that people are used to hearing or used to dealing with. And there is certainly a lot of stigma. And when someone comes, just as by way of example, when someone comes and says that, right, and says, oh, I want to kill myself, I want to commit suicide, I'm barely hanging on, right? Part of them, of course, really does want to do that. But part of them wants to be heard. They want to be heard without being sent to the hospital. In other words, the reason they're coming to tell me that is not so that I freak out in the moment, and say, oh my gosh, we have to get you help right now. That usually is not what's happening, because in the moment when they needed the help, they either dealt with it or they went to someone. And once again, I'm not the address for that usually. When they're coming to me with a shaila, right, so it's either a halachic question or it's a philosophical question. But here the need is, as you say, to be able to talk about it in a stigma-free zone. In other words, to come and say, look, you're not gonna just cart me off to some institution, right? You're gonna let me talk. You're gonna let me say what's happening with me and what's going on, right? That's where we come in. And of course, I'm sensitive. If the person does need help, of course, I send them to get help. I'm not trying to say I don't do that, But there's also that other area, which is exactly what Magna Nefesh and what I do, which is to basically give people an ear to their problems, what's going on, try to help them without being in a judgmental space or what they feel is a judgmental space.
Okay, Rav Yoni, let's get into some of that tachlis issue right now. I'd like to know some of the major halachic issues, if you can outline some of them that have come up specifically in the wake of October 7th, some of the major issues regarding mental health that you've had to deal with over the past 10 months.
Sure. I would say maybe two prime examples, could be Shabbos, and Nida. That would be probably two prime examples. Shabbos, I would say, a lot of people are dealing with to some extent. I mean, I think we all remember that first Shabbos, right? So that first Shabbos right after October 7th, everybody had their radios on. I'm pretty sure, people were walking around with phones. A lot of people, I'm fairly certain that that's true. Certainly in the shoulder were people with phones. Everyone was very much on edge. Now try to imagine someone who's been like that for the last 10 months, right? So in other words, if in that first Shabbos, some people needed calming, maybe also the second Shabbos, maybe also the third, but then slowly but surely you get better, so to speak, and you're able to handle the situation. You're not as worried anymore. You're not as on edge. And then you slip back into routine. For people with, say, anxiety, it's not like that at all, right? I'm not saying, once again, everybody, but for some people, and they would like to know whether they can carry their phones all the time, whether they can leave a radio on all the time, whether they can check their phones and check the news, etc., to make sure that everything is okay. Certainly about, answering, calling a therapist on Shabbat, answering calls from a child or a spouse, etc. Those things can definitely come up. Those are relatively easy questions, right? But then you come to the harder questions where people say, my wife is at home alone with the kids. I've been away for, whether it's a month or a month and a half or 2 months even. I want to come home, but the only time I can come home is Shabbos, right? So am I allowed to drive home on Shabbos, to be with my wife? And part of it is mental health. Part of it is other things, etc. But while the first questions that I mentioned, are, I would say, more on a rabbinic level of prohibition. Certainly driving on Shabbat is a Torah prohibition. And once you let one soldier, you could say you're letting all the soldiers, etc., etc. So these questions become a bit more thorny, obviously, as we go along.
Okay. And how about the NIDA questions you mentioned before?
NIDA questions are also, I'll give one example, and it'll be like an example, I'm saying, for other things. Okay. So a fellow came back, right, from the army. He didn't describe everything that went on there to me, but he was 2-3 months almost straight, basically, in Gaza. He saw things, he experienced things, he lost friends. He came back a different person. That's how he described it. That's how his wife described it. When I say a different person, I mean that he's in his own world. Okay, he's not a bad person. He just doesn't respond almost to anything. In other words, like, his life is a bit emptier than it was. He has children at home, he has a wife at home, but he can't even help to shower the kids. Okay, he can't even help to do, the simplest tasks around the house. And his wife doesn't feel like there's any sort of connection and affection, between the two of them. And once again, it's not because he doesn't want to be with her. He doesn't even realize that she's there. In other words, it's not that, oh, I'm not interested in that. I'm in like a different world. My head is like totally, I'm not even noticing that I'm not getting or giving the affection. That's where the husband was. And she wanted to know, she wanted to try and rekindle, so to speak, whatever was going on between them. And her cycle was, sorry to get technical, but her cycle was short. So in other words, between her becoming tehorah, meaning able to touch, and between her becoming nida a second time, let's say there were only like 10 days in the month. Okay. Now she wanted to know whether she could give up on the 7 clean days and just go to mikvah even before the 7 clean days were over, to do what people call nida deoraita, in order to enhance the amount of time that they have, in order to rekindle that affection and to come back to being a regular family. So I bet that you and your other listeners couldn't even have imagined a question like that. In other words, it wouldn't have even occurred to you that would have been like, something that would somehow be connected to the war. But here you have someone who needs to get back, right? The soldier, the husband, needs to get back into routine. But that routine can be many times hampered by the dictates of halacha. And coming back into a regular family situation, once again, there's a wife involved, there are kids involved, there's shlom bayit involved, there are long-term considerations to take into account. This is not a simple question.
That's very difficult. I don't know, Rav Yoni, if this is answerable or something that you're willing to answer, but how do you even go about thinking about what to do in a case like that? Because the halacha, as it is on the books, is quite clear. Going to
Sure.
Nida D'Oraita is not a simple thing at all, and ignoring Rabbi Zera and the rest. How does one even begin to consider a leniency in a case like that when it does not seem to be, at least in this example, a case of cholesh sheish bo sakana? It doesn't seem to be something where there's a life in danger, but it does seem to be there's a relationship in danger. I'm just curious how you even start.
Not only a relationship, a whole family in danger. By But the answer, I'm not sure that I would like to specifically answer the question on your podcast, but I will say this. First of all, when it comes to questions of this magnitude, to me, it is a question of some magnitude. I never make the decision alone. So the first thing I did was to go to other Rabbanim and to ask their opinion and to get their feedback. I would hesitate to answer any such question on my own. Due to the complexity, you can always go to another rabbi, and I do go to other Rabbanim and discuss with them. But I think that what we really need to understand here, and this is what's important to me to convey, is that with mental health, we always need to look down the road. In other words, it is never as simple as looking at what's happening right now. So right now, you're right. It's not a chol sheyesh bo sakana. And I'm not claiming that I could say with any sort of definitive assertion that it would be a chol sheyesh bo sakana down the line, but it's definitely something that needs to be taken into account. For a person with a mental health condition to not have the family supports and to not be able to work their way back into routine slowly but surely, many times the alternative to that is to fall into something much, much worse. And we should not be blind to that. So I'm not saying, once again, that based on that possibility, I'm automatically assuming that things are the worst that they could be. But but we need to understand PTSD. We need to understand PTSD. We need to understand what it looks like. We need to understand what it looks like when it's not treated. We need to understand what it looks like when there are no supports in place. And it's that fact that leads me to try and find a solution, even sometimes at the expense of certain halachic principles.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. I have another question, but it's not really about halacha. It's more about hashkafa. Have you found that there are any specific issues in hashkafic approaches to Judaism that have been affected by the war in the realm of mental health specifically? Meaning, we talk about the way people have in machshava, the way they think about the Torah in general. Has mental health affected that at all over the past 10 months? Has there been something about the war where you've seen a certain change in that way?
I mean, yes. It's just, look, let's be clear. Once again, we all are affected by the war, right? The only difference with mental health is many times how potent the change is and how significant the effect is. Just like I gave the example before about the first Shabbos, versus the second, the third, the fourth, and onwards, where many times people will gradually move back into their routine to whatever extent. Also here, meaning all of us, I think, ask questions about machshava, about Jewish philosophy, about right and wrong. How could God have let this happen? Things along those lines. I think we all think theological thoughts, in times like this. Those with mental health concerns just think them so much more potently and usually so much more personally. So in other words, they think the very same thoughts that we have, but then they think, why wouldn't this have happened to me? I'm not a good person. Why should it happen to such a good person? Or people with suicidal ideation will say it's not fair. I want to die and I don't get to die. That person didn't want to die and they died, etc. And I know that sounds horrifying, but that's how they think about it. They think, it's just not, it's not right, so to speak, that person, it should have happened to me, etc. Or an individual's depression, which is fueled by the events that surround the person, might be extra fueled, so to speak, through these events. So in other words, a person, all these feelings, once again, that I don't think are relatively different for a person with mental health concern, will just be so much more augmented, as a result of the event, if that makes sense.
Yes, it definitely does. In that case, Rav Yoni, looking forward as we're entering the end of the summer, coming towards Elul and the Yamim Noraim, hopefully there will be an end in sight for the war. But as long as it continues to go on as it is right now, do you have any message you'd like to give listeners about thinking about their mental health, looking towards the future?
Yes. I first want to say two quick things. Okay. Number one of the main messages that I've received since the beginning of the war is that people with mental health concerns think that they don't have the right, so to speak, to ask for help. because what they say to themselves is what we all say to ourselves. Everybody's hurting. My troubles are not our troubles. You should see that family, you should see that person, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody needs help. Why am I special? And it's not that people don't need help, but just because they do doesn't mean you don't. So I want to tell anybody with a mental health, concern, you still deserve help. And not only do you still deserve help, you sometimes deserve it even more during wartime. So definitely search that out. Don't assume that, people are too busy to help you or whatever it is. You need the help. You deserve the help. You should get the help, and that's number one. Number two, especially going into Yamim Noraim, I have to say this. Once again, it's to everybody, okay? But it's specifically to people with mental health concerns. Don't engage in the blame game. I know that tshuva becomes vidui, becomes alchet, becomes I'm a bad person, etc. I'm aware that that's true even without a mental health concern involved, but certainly with people with mental health concerns, many times take things very personally and start, like carrying the weight of the entire war and its effects on their shoulders. And that's true now during Tisha B'Av. It was true. Like I know a lot of people who during the 9 days felt that way, and I'm sure it'll be true coming into the Yamim Noraim. So do not do that. It's not your fault. We will get through this together. Focus on being close to Ribono Shel Olam. Focus on the closest we have to Hashem during the Yamim Noraim, not necessarily on the pain of blame and guilt and all those things. That's not going to get you anywhere. God willing, Hashem will bring us through this war as well.
Amen. Rav Yoni Rosensweig, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.